I will now move on to the first presentation. And I will first give you an introduction to PFOS and some of activities related to alternatives to PFOS. So PFOS is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, a salt form of which is shown here on this slide. And it was listed in 2009, as I have mentioned before. And what's particular about PFOS is that it's a chemical that's still very widely used today for a variety of purposes. And the reason it is used so widely is because it has some very unique properties in that it has fat and water repellency, extreme stability, and resistant to extreme conditions. So you will hear more about the chemistry of PFOS in the next presentation. Now, PFOS is listed in Annex B of the Convention. What this means is that the production and use of PFOS has to be restricted. If you compare, chemicals that are listed under Annex A are regulated a more strict regime, whereby use and production have to be prohibited except for some time-limited exemptions. Now, because of the listing in Annex B, there's continued use and production of PFOS. And the exemptions for use are expressed as, or are listed as, what's called acceptable purposes. So, acceptable purposes are those applications which at the time of listing were considered by parties to necessitate the continued use of PFOS because alternatives were not available. And you can see there's a long list on this slide. And I'd like to draw your attention to the ones in bold. These are so-called open applications. And in general, what that means is that these processes do not include a recovery step for PFOS. So that results in widespread dispersion to the environment and consequently increased risk of exposure to humans and wildlife. And one good example shown here is the use of PFOS in firefighting foams. They are also listed in the Annex B specific exemptions, and these are applications for which it was felt by parties at the time of listing that alternatives were available, but time was needed to be phased in. Time was needed for their phasing. So these are those so-called time-limited exemptions. And again, as you can see, there's a long list, and many of them are open applications. So despite the listing of all these acceptable purposes and specific exemptions, the aim of the convention is to ultimately eliminate PFOS. So there are a number of mechanisms under the convention to encourage parties in that direction. Namely, they have to report on progress made in eliminating PFOS every 4 years. Also, they are encouraged to phase out PFOS through the use of alternatives and to undertake research on safer alternatives. Finally, there's an evaluation process that is foreseen by the convention, and this is due to start in 2015 and take place every 4 years. Now, I will turn to activities related to alternatives to PFOS that has been going on under the convention. The aim of the activities under the convention has been to provide guidance to parties and to provide information on the phase out of PFOS. And much of this work has relied heavily on the work done by the POPs Review Committee, which is the subsidiary scientific body of the convention. Starting in 2009, the committee was requested by the COP to develop recommendations on risk reduction on the use and production of PFOS. And the committee, as a result of this work, recommendations were adopted at the fifth meeting of the Conference of the Parties, and the COP encouraged parties to implement the recommendations and further report on the experience. So now the Secretariat has collected such information, and it will be submitted to the COP in April. Another important work is a guidance on alternatives to PFOS, its source, and related chemicals. So here, the objective of this guidance was to provide an overview of alternatives currently on the market and some of their properties. It was again developed by the POPROC, and this is a living document, which means that it undergoes regular update. Currently, there's an ad hoc working group of the committee that works on an intersessional basis to revise this document. More recently, at the last meeting, the POPROC adopted recommendations on alternatives to PFOS in open applications. These recommendations were developed on the basis of a technical paper on the identification and assessment of these alternatives. So this paper is provides a little bit more in-depth information on alternatives to PFOS than the previous work that was started prior to 2006. So this you will hear more about the alternatives and the technical paper in the second presentation. Now, there are also other guidances related to PFOS that have been developed under the convention. Two very important ones are meant to assist parties in updating their national implementation plans with information regarding how they are going to meet the obligations of the conventions with regard to PFOS. One of them is an inventory guidance for PFOS, and the other one is on best available techniques and best environmental practices for the use of PFOS. The Secretariat has been organizing a number of webinars on this issue in case you're interested. Also, the continued use of PFOS, of course, results in waste, and the convention requires that such waste be treated in an environmentally sound manner. So, under the Basel Convention, there's currently guidelines on the ESM of PFOS waste that is under development, being led by Canada. So, to summarize, PFOS was listed in 2009. It is a chemical that has exceptional properties, and because of that, it is still used and produced. The convention would like to encourage parties to move to substitution of PFOS through the use of safer alternatives. And in that regard, there are a number of activities ongoing under the convention to promote the risk reduction and phase out of PFOS. So if you're going to be in Geneva in April, let me remind you that this year, the Conference of the Party to the Stockholm Convention, the meeting of the COP will be held back-to-back with that of the meeting of the COP of the Basel and Rotterdam Convention. So there's a number of items related to PFOS on the agenda. As I mentioned, there's this process for evaluation, and that's meant to happen every 4 years, and a draft process will be presented to the COP for its consideration. Of course, the COP will also take a look at the recommendations developed by POPROC on alternatives to the use of PFOS. And finally, the COP will also consider information provided by parties on the experience in implementing PFOS recommendation on the risk reduction for the use of PFOS. And here's a list of further references that will give you more details on all that I have been telling you about. Okay, so with that, I will close my presentation and let you listen to Mr. Stefan Posner, who was the expert who worked on the technical paper on PFOS in open applications.
Thank you very much. Yes, yes. Just click here to get my presentation. Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stefan Posner. I involved for a time back in the writing and the revisions and all that of those papers that Melissa mentioned. Intention with my presentation here is to give you an overview of the fluorochemistry and conclusions on this technical paper on alternatives to PFOS in open applications. Just a short, I start with a short introduction to the fluorochemistry in addition to what Melissa just mentioned about the unique properties of this chemistry. That the whole group, the umbrella group, are abbreviated PFCs, polyfluoroalkylated substances, a very large and complex group of organic substances, and they are used in a lot of applications, both industrial and household applications. And the main characteristics is that they are where in the structure of these chemicals, the hydrogens in the carbon backbone structure are replaced by fluorine. And you can see in this the picture, the model of the PFOS molecule, where the green balls are actually fluorine that has fully replaced the hydrogen atoms on the carbon backbone structure. And those chemicals, those fluorine compounds that have no hydrogen left but only fluorine, are called perfluorinated. Otherwise, if there is hydrogen left in the structure, together with fluorine, they are called polyfluorinated. All these chemicals are synthetically produced. They were started in the early 50s, so there are no PFCs in nature. They are all man-made. Essentially, the fluorochemistry have two kind of compounds used. Either they are surfactants or fluoropolymers. As surfactants, they are structured in the way as other surfactants in the general terms. They have, if you see this figure, you have a hydrophilic group, the red part. You have a spacer in between the hydrophilic, and the green part is, in general terms, in surfactants called the hydrophobic part. In this sense, it's the fluorinated tail of these extremely efficient surfactants, and that is the point with the fluorinated surfactants are extremely more efficient as a surfactant than ordinary surfactants. If they are not surfactants, they are introduced in the application as fluoropolymers. These are the two main options for them, and they are in various forms, tailored for their specific uses. Essentially, what the point with these chemicals is to reject water from, or a liquid, I would say, from a surface. We talked about wettability. If you have a non-wettable surface, you see to the right figure, you have a drop of liquid which doesn't wet the surface. This is one of the main uses of this fluorochemistry. When the fluorochemistry is used to protect the surface, the other way around, is when the fluorochemistry is used to wet and remove dirt, for instance, from the surface. It has a very good wettability. Some fluorosurfactants for cleaning purposes, for instance. So there, both figures represent different kind of basic purposes for this chemistry. The kind of fluorochemicals, the chain length has an importance on what we call the surface tension, the surface energy of an object or of a liquid. And you can see here that the horizontal axis presents a number of hydrocarbons, the carbons involved in the backbone structure of a fluorochemical, and the vertical axis is the surface energy. And if you have shorter chemicals, shorter by backbone carbon length, you don't reach the very low surface energies as for surface chemicals with the longer carbon chain length. This is important to know when you apply this chemistry into certain applications. Here is an example of different liquids represent surface tension, and you have different polymers, solid surfaces that represent their surface energies. And the physics is, if you have a liquid that has a higher surface tension than the surface, it doesn't wet the surface. So for objects that have a fluoropolymer surface, for instance, it's very, very hard to wet it with virtually anything. You have some exceptions. The methyl chloride is mentioned here. And of course, the opposite. If you have a surface tension that is very, very low, lower than the object, the surface, you wet the surface, of course. There are two main production lines for the production of fluorochemicals. We have the electrochemical fluorination, abbreviated ECF, and then we have the telomerization. These two were presented to the world in the early 50s and have developed in different variations, but essentially they are more or less the same today. These are two different process lines for the production of fluorochemicals. The first one, the electrochemical fluorination process, the ECF, is a process where you essentially work with the perfluoroalkyl sulfonyl fluoride. This is the process that has its home for PFOS. If the carbon chain length is 8, you will have a PFOS-based process, simply speaking. And all these chemicals that go in the ECF process we address them as input PFCs, input fluorochemicals from the ECF process. And depending on the carbon backbone length, you have a principal or final end products that are perfluorinated sulfonic acids. And if the carbon chain length is 8, you have eventually you have PFOS as a final stable degradation product. The other process, the fluorotelomere process to production of fluorosurfactants and finally for polymers, is based on a bit different chemistry, but essentially the end products, the fluorosurfactants, are a bit different in chemical structure, but they are used more or less to the same applications as the ECF surfactants. But here you have a different view. If all these input PFCs from the fluorotelomere process end up in perfluorinated carboxylic acids. And if the backbone carbon chain length is 8, you will have the principal degradation product, PFOA. And with different chain lengths, you have, of course, some of the other perfluorinated carboxylic acids. Nowadays, the sulfonic acid chemistry is not an issue in the telomere chemistry. Aspects of substitution. In the technical paper, there were the red line, or the green line, I would say, through the whole paper was to look at feasible alternatives to PFOS. And a number of parameters were considered: technical feasibility, health and environmental effects, cost effectiveness, efficiency, availability, accessibility, and socioeconomic considerations. And an overview of this map of alternatives show this study that there are alternatives for all these open applications that are presented in the Stockholm Convention work. What is a bit the implications on the market volumes, on certain market information is a bit hard to assess, but the chemicals that could replace PFOS do exist on the market. Go shortly through the overview of the different applications. We have these three ones. We've made a summary overview on to what extent PFOS is still used. And for aviation hydraulic oils, there are a number of fluorinated substances used, but still you can see, I don't go into detail, maybe it will take a bit more too much time, but for some areas, for instance for the firefighting foams, the alternative chemistry is very well described, which is not the case really for the hydraulic oils. There is only indication that other substances other alternatives to PFOS are used. For pesticides, there are a number of non-chemical methods and pesticides other than PFOS described. But still, the degree of information varies between the different open applications. For metal plating, very well established that there are alternatives used on the market, especially for the decorative chrome plating, but also indications that are alternatives for hard chrome plating, which is the toughest process concerning to switch PFOS over to an alternative. There are questions though on the efficiency, etc., and the applicability, but still alternatives, the 6-2 FTS as it's addressed, is used on the market. For electronic parts, there are under development alternatives, but there were no specific information on which alternatives by chemistry, but addressed that this is under in progress. Chemically driven oil production, indications that are telomere-based surfactants used, and the number of, as you can see here in the part shown on this table, that there are a number of alternatives used to PFOS. For a group for carpets, leather, textiles, and upholstery, it's established information that there are other groups and categories of fluorochemicals and also non-fluorochemicals used to PFOS, where at the same time PFOS-related substances have been phased out in most countries. So the experience from that particular open application, what is an established market that is increasing on alternatives. For paper and packaging, it's more or less the same as for carpets, leather, and textiles, and you have similar pictures for the coating and coating additives. For cleaning agents, you have a variety of alternatives used on the market. So for these applications, there is quite a big a growing market on alternatives to PFOS. Conclusions. We can conclude that there are alternatives for all the open applications to PFOS, but Still, there are challenges, of course, for major data gaps, for the quantities of these alternatives used on the market, and cost considerations for the alternatives. There are still lacks on the toxicological and the ecotoxicological properties of many of these alternatives. There are, of course, exceptions mentioned here, but for many of these alternatives, there is still a challenge to get more toxicological and ecotoxical information. But having said that, the recent research going on toxicology and ecotoxicology, monitoring and environment is in very, very high progress. So in the very near future, we will have a lot more data on these alternative chemicals. With the current situation, there is, due to the lack of important toxicology and ecotoxicology, it's not possible to make comprehensive risk assessment analysis on a number of these alternatives. But as I said, as research is moving very quickly forward, this will be in a better situation in the near future. We also found in the study that a relative to PFOS, the perfluorohexansulfonyl fluoride, which is sometimes used as an alternative to PFOS, is not a feasible alternative to PFOS, since this chemical and its related substances has similar properties to PFOS and may therefore be considered as hazardous concerning toxicology and ecotoxicology as PFOS. But this is in progress, and it has to be looked further into that specific chemistry. Thanks for your attention.
Sure. So thank you, Stefan, for that overview. We will now move on to a short presentation on the recommendations developed by the POPs Review Committee on the basis of the technical paper that Stefan has just described to you. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Samuel Banda, who was and is the chair of the working group on PFOS alternatives, who was supposed to give this presentation, could not join us today. So I will instead take you through the recommendations. Now, these recommendations were developed by the POPROC in response to a request made by the COP at its 5th meeting. And as I said, it was based on the technical paper and on the basis of information submitted by parties and observers, and also, as Stefan has mentioned, the technical paper itself resulted from a comprehensive review of publicly available information. Now, these recommendations are developed by POPROC, and they are meant for consideration by the Conference of the Parties. Now, one group of recommendations relates specifically to a group of applications. And for the applications listed here, the committee considers that there are enough alternatives in the market. And so parties should be encouraged to stop using PFOS for these applications, although these applications are still listed as acceptable purposes and specific exceptions. Now, Stefan has mentioned metal plating, which is listed as an acceptable purpose. And in this case, the recommendation is to restrict the use of PFOS for this application to closed-loop systems. Again, here to prevent, of course, dispersion of PFOS to the environment. Now, going on to some more applications, Stefan has highlighted there are some cases for which information is lacking even on the use of PFOS itself, on whether it's used, the quantities used, and so on. So in this case, the committee recommends requesting parties and observers to provide such information to know whether, well, if there is a continued use of PFOS for these applications. With regard to the use of PFOS for the control of leaf cutting ants, which is a practice that goes on in several countries, especially in Southern America, it was considered that there was a need for more peer-reviewed studies to evaluate the feasibility of switching to alternatives to PFOS. And so in this case, the committee recommended the COP to consider the need for undertaking such studies, for example, pilot projects in close cooperation with the national authorities in those countries. As Stefan has mentioned, although there is a lot of information on alternatives available on the market, there's still major information gaps regarding these alternatives. So especially with regard to their toxicological and ecotoxicological properties. So parties should be encouraged to continue to identify and to assess these alternatives in order to fill the information gaps. Now, what's also important is that this information be made publicly available so that they can be used in risk assessment studies by bodies such as the POPROC. So if such information is available, then of course it should be made available, it should be provided to the POPROC so that it could be included in future revisions of the guidance and alternatives, and furthermore for the evaluation for the continued need of PFOS for specific exemptions and acceptable purposes. Also, in terms of future work, as highlighted by Stefan, the study, the technical paper, has revealed that there are some alternatives for which the information available indicates that they may be of concern with regard to their health and environmental effects. So the committee recommends that there should be further evaluation of such alternatives. Finally, the committee would like the COP to give it the mandate to revise the guidance on alternatives to PFOS to incorporate the more recent information contained in the technical paper, and also to invite the committee to continue its work on the assessment of PFOS and to participate in evaluating the continued need for PFOS for acceptable purposes and specific exemptions. So that was a summary of the recommendations, and I will now open the floor for any questions you may have. Thank you.